Should I switch my phone off after I've...
Sure.
All right, okay, if it's
completely up to you. Completely up to you.
But does it interfere if somebody calls me? Would that interfere with...
I don't actually know, because I've never actually had it before. So
okay,
here we are. This is live. We're going out live. Look, here we are.
Okay. Bismillah.
So hi guys, how are you doing today? I'm with none other than Dr. Usama Hasan. Very lucky to have him here, a man of his sort of experience and history and knowledge. And today we are going to talk about Islam and science and many other things as well, which I'm sure you guys will definitely get you a chance to ask questions. And let's go straight into it. So some of you may know who Dr. Usama is. For those of you who do not, Dr. Usama is, I believe, on your Wikipedia, it says you are an astronomer. And you know on Wikipedia everything is true. So I've got no reason to doubt that.
I'm a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society.
There you go. A fellow...
I should say Bismillah, Assalamu alaikum. Hello.
Go for it.
Hi viewers. Yeah, I know it's a pleasure to sit with you.
No, honestly, the pleasure is all mine. So, just to give a brief background, I believe I knew Dr. Usama more than a few years ago. But I was working with the Dean Institute, and they had this conference called "Have Muslims Misunderstood Evolution?" Now, I was someone who was a bit on the fence about evolution. My gut told me it's kind of real, that it's true. But a lot of my co-religionists said, no, it's not real, it's Darwin, he was making stuff up, and the Quran says this, and the Quran says that. So I was a bit confused. I didn't know where to go. So when I heard that the Dean Institute were having this conference called "Have Muslims Misunderstood Evolution?" Actually, you can check it out on YouTube, it's there as well. You can see Dr. Usama in that as well. I went to that conference, and I actually went as a volunteer, because I didn't want to pay for it, but I wanted to be I wanted to see it. So I watched that conference, and I came away with watching 3 Muslim people qualified in their field of inquiry. There's, I think, an evolutionary biologist, or 2 of them, and yourself, who's a scientist, and you are practicing Muslims, and you said, as a Muslim, I believe in evolution, and there is no contradiction. There's no, what do you want to call it? I don't have to compromise my religion to believe in evolution.
Yeah, there were 3 of us saying that.
3 of us.
Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's amazing. So, I mean, from then on, I've been interested in what Dr. Usama has to say, especially with regards to science and religion. And here we're going to discuss some interesting ideas, some history, and hopefully also some future as well. What is the trajectory of the Muslim world with regards to science? Where are we going? Are we in the right direction or in the wrong direction? But if I could ask yourself, what has been the response? I mean, early in the back in the days when you said, as a Muslim, and you are by the way, Dr. Usama is also a qualified imam. Is that the correct? Qualified imam who believes in evolution. I remember when you first came out and said this to, I believe, your congregation, the mosque. There was a bit of resistance, a bit of controversy, and they did not take this news or this sort of scientific fact that well. So, what was your response?
Okay, so like many Muslims who grew up in Britain or in the West, and around the world, in fact, I was brought up being taught that evolution was all wrong.
Yeah.
That it was kufr, and clearly it was nonsense. I was taught wrongly, like many people, that evolution says that we've descended from apes, which is not true. Of course, it says we have a common ancestor with apes, etc. In fact, I remember one of my very lovely English Christian primary school teachers. He wasn't a devout Christian, but in the 80s, there was strong Christian ethos at my primary school in North London. I remember one of my favourite teachers there. She was the first one in school who talked about evolution, and she rubbished Darwin.
Oh, really?
She said there was a man called Charles Darwin who had the audacity to say that we descended from monkeys or whatever it was. And so that just confirmed for me that what the parents and imams and people were saying at mosque.
Yeah.
My primary school teacher, a lovely English.
She wouldn't lie about this kind of stuff. So yeah.
So like most people, we just brought up with this idea, from a young age that this is one of the many things wrong in the world. That people believe in evolution, and clearly Charles Darwin was some evil man who was trying to shake, destroy religion and shake our faith in God and all that. And then, of course, from about my teens, whenever it all appeared, like many of us did, we became big Harun Yahya fans, or maybe, I don't know, 18 or 20 when Harun Yahya's books came out. And of course, they were very glossy, and if you didn't know very much biology, etc., they could be quite deceptive. So I was in that for a while. As I've said before, by the grace of God, I served as an imam and khatib and trustee at Masjid Tawheed in Leighton, not too far from here, for a total of 30 years, actually, roughly, because I started young. But I can remember teaching from Harun Yahya's book in the mosque in Ramadan for our Ramadan series of lectures, because as an imam, alhamdulillah, hafiz of Quran, and a scientist, religion and science has always been close to my heart, Islam and science. And I always tried to address these issues. I gave a talk on astronomy and Islam in the mosque. I gave many talks related to religion and science. Many years ago, I taught from Harun Yahya's book in Ramadan, even though my speciality is physics and the physical sciences, not biology. My biology was always quite weak. And I was presenting his argument and saying, evolution is all wrong. But then what happened was I was invited to speak on religion and science at a number of prestigious places, like the Cheltenham Science Festival twice, the BA Festival of Science in Liverpool, on the BBC Radio 4, TV as well, I think, interfaith discussions around religion and science. And when you go into those discussions, you cannot shy away from the evolution question. It's a big question. And I found all the Christian scientists and Jewish scientists who were strong believers, they all accepted evolution. And I found that a bit odd at first, but of course I had to grapple with that issue. So I did read a bit more about the biology. My wife's a biologist, actually, so she helped me with that, and I came to that conclusion that evolution is not against the Quran. If you look at the tafsir more carefully, you look at evolution more carefully, there is no contradiction, and arguably, in fact, you could argue there are verses of the Quran which support evolution, and hence that's when it started out. I wrote the article in The Guardian 10 years ago. The Guardian edited it quite a bit. In fact, they made it quite incoherent in my view. That's why that article, which caused me a lot of problems, it's a bit of a shame, because a lot of it was taken out by the Guardian. But that one thing led to another, and it led to a huge uproar in the mosque, Masjid Tawheed in Leighton. And eventually, there were other reasons, of course, other issues, but that was the main one, the evolution issue. Eventually, I had to leave the mosque. In fact, I resigned, actually, because there was too much headache for me and for many other people.
Okay, fair enough. So when you changed your mind and you told people, yes, evolution is real, or yes, I believe in evolution as a Muslim, and you left the mosque, did you find any supporters of yourself, or was it just a pretty lonely place in the beginning, would you say? Like Muslim people who also shared your opinion?
Yes, I wrote my Guardian article, which was published on September the 11th, actually, 2008. Right. And before that, I'd probably just discussed it with one or two close friends who are also Muslim scientists. And when I wrote that article, I had support from a handful of people. There were a few of my friends who said we support what you're saying. We can't support you publicly, and we can't say this stuff publicly, but well done for saying what you're saying. And then, of course, it took 2.5 years for disquiet at the mosque to eventually increase slowly and then become a full-fledged campaign against my views on it. And that's when more people learned about it. And of course, there was a lot of flack. A lot of resistance, as you said. But then slowly, more and more support developed as well, because the campaign, the big public campaign, started against me at the mosque in January 2011. And the evolution debate with the Dean Institute that you mentioned was January 2013.
Yes.
So it's exactly 2 years later. So, in those 2 years, the Dean Institute had decided to do a debate, and I think it's fair to say most of the Muslim audience were probably
they changed their mind
against our side, but a lot of people were on our side. And
by the end of it, I think there was a huge.
Oh, was there? Okay,
that's what I felt.
Okay.
That's what I felt anyway. But
I could see there was more acceptance to this, or more respect for our side, even if
it wasn't simply just rubbished away. It was a serious alternative.
And ever since then, there's been a steady increase in support for this kind of thing. I think we're going to talk about our international task force soon.
Absolutely.
But you'll notice there 14 leading Muslim scientists and theologians, imams, and sheikhs all endorsed evolution, including human evolution.
That's amazing. I've just got a question here from JK saying, Hang on, let's just say this. Why do so many Islamic scholars worldwide believe that affirming evolution as reality constitutes kufr? What would you say is the...
Right. So if you don't mind, I'm going to talk to the camera.
Go for it,
actually.
go for
It might be good for the viewers. So the bottom line is that people think that the theory of evolution contradicts the teaching of the Quran, especially the teaching of the story of Adam and Eve. Most Muslim scholars and most Muslims, the vast majority, take that story very literally. And then, of course, the story of Adam and Eve, and in the Garden of Eden, the whole drama with Satan and the forbidden tree, Iblis. Now, because the traditional belief is that was in heaven, actually, or paradise, it was a different garden to the one on earth, and that when Adam and Eve ate from the forbidden tree, they were sent down to earth. And then the human history here developed from then. It's a kind of natural, logical belief to say, well, evolution can't possibly have happened on Earth. Human beings cannot have possibly evolved. And the traditional belief is basically that if you were to wind back the time on Earth and you had a camera like this one watching what's happening, you would literally see Adam and Eve pop out of nowhere, from a parallel universe, from a different dimension, if you like. I think that's what many traditional Muslim scholars believe. Now, and that troubled me for a while. I'm a traditional trained imam who learned the Quran and Hadith and the commentaries for a long time. So I had to look into that in a lot of detail. And I found that even in the traditional commentaries of the Quran, like Tabari and Ibn Kathir, that traditional view is not the only one. There is another early view in very early Islam, because Tabari and Ibn Kathir mention it, which says that the Garden of Eden was on earth and it wasn't in heaven. So there was no question of coming from a different place. It all happened on earth. And that's one of the issues. In my presentation on evolution, you'll find the slides online. I answer a number of misconceptions as to why Muslims reject evolution, especially human evolution. That is one of them. And my answer is that the traditional commentary in the Quran, yes, there is one understanding of that story which would rule out evolution, human evolution. But there is another early view which is entirely compatible with human evolution. And I have to say, at that Deen Institute debate, you see, one of the views on the other side was that Muslims can accept all of evolution except human evolution.
So animals is fine.
So plants and animals, that's all fine. Human evolution becomes the big problem. There was another chap, there was Harun Yahya's student on that debate as well, who was saying, there's no evolution at all. And there are other people saying that, like Muzaffar Iqbal and others, Sayyid Hussain Nasr possibly.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
They said things like bees have always been bees and ants have always been ants.
Oh, okay.
There's been no evolution. But, there's overwhelming evidence for that. But the main sticking point is human evolution. Now, I've argued that that's based on a particular reading of the Quran, which is not the only one. But when people think it's the only view of the Quran, then, of course, they say it's kufr to reject that, because if you don't accept that, then you deny the Quran in their view.
Of course.
So that's
very
helpful. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. So on that point, would you like to start looking at the document of the... we have a document here that I believe Dr. Hasan co-wrote, or you...
I convened and edited this international task force on Islam and science and questions.
So,
and I hope you can paste it.
I'm going to paste this in the comment section. I actually think you have to put your email in, and then they'll send you an email, and then you'll get the report. But I will share our screen with you so you can see it regardless. I will do that now. So sorry, this is a bit tricky. Hang on. Share, screen share. Application. Just go for this one. Share. Oh, there we go. That's it. That's called infinite regress, right? Yes. So
very, very impressive. I hope it doesn't.
No. What we'll do?
Crash the entire system.
Where are we? Where did it go? There it is. Great. Now let me move this over here. So this is what they're seeing. Right. Okay. Are they seeing us as well?
No, they didn't. No, they're only seeing that. Okay.
They're only seeing that.
Yeah. So I suppose, as you said, by the grace of God, I trained as a Hafiz and Imam, but also as a theoretical physicist and a neural nets person with a PhD and etc. So I'm passionate about religion and science. And the relationship between the two is, for me, when it boils down to it, very simple. I believe strongly in the existence of Allah, of God. There is a God. There's only one God.
Yep.
And God created the world, including all the laws behind it. God also revealed many truths to the great prophets and messengers throughout history, and the revelations, the scripture which comes from God is also from God. So we have to try and get to the heart of it in such a way that there is no contradiction, because then there cannot possibly be a contradiction there, unless there's a contradiction within God, which is impossible. So because they're from the same source, for me it's very obvious. The universe in creation and
they have to be in harmony.
Scripture, they have to be in harmony.
Yeah, absolutely.
But all where they appear to be not in harmony is where there's misunderstandings of one or the other or both.
Yeah.
But there are difficult questions, that we have to deal with, especially with the age of scientific rationalism and ever since the scientific revolution in the 15th, 16th century, science has made so much progress.
So many questions for religion, not just Islam, but Christianity. For religion, we've got to sort of up our game and
exactly
up our game.
And when I went to university, when I was an undergrad up at Cambridge, I noticed the Christian believers who were scientists, the physicists, especially John Polkinghorne, David Wilkinson, and many other people like that, were giving very interesting and sophisticated answers to these questions, really defending faith and God, etc. And I felt I'd never read anything like that from Muslims.
Right.
And
so you were sort of behind.
But slowly, I think the Muslim discourse has developed a long way.
Yeah.
So hence this.
So for the viewers, could you say what this report means, or what's the point of this report?
Yeah. So it's actually entitled "Muslim Responses to Science's Big Questions." So the big question which science poses for religion.
Yeah. So this is a here we
Yep. Thank you. There we are. Islam and science. Muslim responses to science's big questions, and we're very distinguished contributors there, as you can see. And the big questions are things like, does science disprove the existence of God?
Yep.
Or prove it?
Okay.
Or can it do neither? I mean, that's the big question.
Yep.
Another question is precisely about evolution. Does evolution contradict religion? And the answer for me is very clearly no. God created us via evolution, so it's very simple. But also, where do the laws of science come from? The laws of nature. How do they relate to God? Can we prove the existence of God, etc.? And there's other issues like divine action and miracles. Then there's ethical issues, especially medical ethics. We have something like that here, and we have a number of, I hope, interesting.
So where would you like to start?
There. I would like to start with actually the. Well, firstly, from that basic idea of the relationship between God and science, or religion and science. So it would come in the first essay. Really.
94.
Yeah. No, we can leave that. Don't go into that. I think it will be very difficult to read. I think it's best to keep this table of contents.
So would you like to turn the camera here or on us?
Us now.
Us now. Okay, cool, that's fine.
Thanks.
Great.
So, and I was saying, I mean, for me, God is the source of the divine knowledge, revelation. God is also the creator of the world, including the laws of science. So there's that harmony there. A popular way of summarizing the relationship, which I think is largely true, is that science answers the question of how we were created, how the world works. It's fantastic, the laws of physics, chemistry, mathematics, biology, leads to engineering. We know so much, and we're able to begin to master so many aspects of nature and produce all this wonderful technology like this, like what we're doing right now. So that's fantastic, but it doesn't really, in my view, answer the question of why we're here in the first place, or what the meaning of life is. The ultimate meaning of life. Is there any ultimate meaning or something beyond? And that's where faith comes in the belief in the beyond, in the transcendent, in the sacred, in meaning to all of this. And the names of God, the beautiful names of God in Islam, provide a very rich background as to why everything is sacred. Now, but what that chapter really does, or some of those essays do, is they chart out what the last 100 years of Muslim responses to these big questions have been like. Before that, actually, the foreword by Professor Ikmaluddin Ihsanoglu, who was chair of the task force and a first-class historian of science, especially of Ottoman science.
Right.
He's written 20 volumes on the history of Ottoman science.
Wow.
But his foreword, I would highly recommend. It's a summary of his brilliant lecture he gave. But after that, there are 4 or 5 major schools of thought which have developed in the last 100 years as Muslims have grappled with these big questions. So, for example, one of them is the school of Sayyid Hussain Nasr and many of his colleagues, including Muzaffar Iqbal and others, who talk about sacred science a lot. So the idea was science is sacred, which I agree with, but they tended to rubbish a lot of modern science, the scientific revolution actually, as well as the Reformation, etc. And they have really downplayed in many ways, in my view, the success and importance of science. And for example, they strongly deny evolution at all, as I said before. They've written and said things like bees have always been there and have never changed, ants and everything else, and God created them like that right from the beginning, you see. And to deny that is to deny the sacred aspect of this, whereas there is obviously that statement is scientifically untrue. The evolution, we see it happening all the time, and you can see the sacredness in the process. Things don't have to be static for it to be sacred. So they emphasize, they were worried, I think I agree with them on one point, which is that a lot of people took the science and thought this means you can do away with God and the transcendent and the sacred, and they were very keen to preserve the sacred, which is their big contribution there. As I said, the downside is sometimes downplaying science or even rejecting some clear modern science like evolution. Another school is part of Ziauddin Sabdar, who is an intellectual alive in London. Him and his school talked a lot about ethical science. They focus on ethics, and they said it's what you do with the science which is important. So especially the technology that we produce. So things like nuclear weapons, biological weapons, etc., medical advances, genetic engineering. They were critical of what they call Western science, which is kind of a misnomer. But they basically said that the West, after the scientific revolution, had become too functional and had commodified science and was using it to produce technology, which was often unethical, weapon of mass destruction and this and that. And again, they were keen to preserve ethics, reintroduce ethics, put the soul back into science, if you like. But I think they forgot the positive aspects of science. For example, medical advances, the discovery of penicillin and all these wonderful advanced medical techniques.
The sort of death rates of children have gone down, poverty has gone down, all sorts of things that have happened over the last 50 to 100 years.
Infant mortality, etc. Antibiotics. So I think they took, it may be fair to say that often they took a very pessimistic view of Western science. And some of their discourse was rooted in anti-colonial, anti-Western discourse anyway, because that was still happening a century ago.
Just on that point, I remember you. Just on that point that they've come from a position of anti-colonialism, which has maybe coloured their view of science. I was speaking to someone quite a few years ago and saying I believe in evolution, and they were saying, "You do realise evolution is like there to promote racism, because they're saying that certain races are more evolved than others." So they were rejecting. These are Muslims who were rejecting evolution based upon race theory or some sort of pure race, whatever. So it's interesting how even they might be rejecting science or evolution for the wrong reasons, not just purely for the science, like, oh, let's look at the evidence, but saying, well, if you say evolution, then that means that we're not the center of God's plan, or that this is promoting Darwin's race theory, or some other reasons why. So it's interesting how that also works as well.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the eugenics, the whole theory.
Eugenics, that's the word I was looking for.
And what the Nazi Aryan supremacist race and all that.
Yeah.
There are people who misuse evolution and biology
but that doesn't mean it's wrong.
Promote the idea of the master race. So so you have to try to sift the truth from
exactly
from the falsehood, like anything else. So that's that school. A third school, which is represented by Professor Abdul Salam, the Pakistani Nobel laureate.
He was of Ahmadi or
yes,
Ismaili.
Ahmadi, and that's sadly one of the reasons why he's revered around the world, and he was a great scientist. But
in our own home country,
Pakistan, because
they don't celebrate him because he's Ahmadi, which is terrible.
It's a tragedy. But he was a great professor at Imperial College, but also set up the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste, in Italy, for the Global South. He helped millions of physicists. His idea was to allow scientists, especially physicists from developing countries, the poorer countries, to come and be able to learn and research. And Trieste, I think it's pronounced, in Italy, that center is still there. That is one of Professor Abdul Salam's many legacies. And of course, he won the Nobel Prize as well.
I never knew that he did that.
For the look it up, International Center for Theoretical Physics, Trieste. Tens of thousands of people have benefited from that, of great scientists. And,
so then what's his...
So he talked about, if I remember correctly, universal science, which so he didn't accept this idea of Western science because he worked internationally. He worked in the US and Europe. He taught at Imperial College in London for many years, but he also brought together scientists from all over the world, the developing world, into this partnership. So he talked about universal science, and I agree with him there that we shouldn't be talking about Western science.
Science is science.
Exactly, in its true form. Yeah, some people may misuse it, but in its purest form, it's a search for truth through experimentation and scientific process. And in fact, in the medieval period, it was a Muslim civilization which was at the forefront of developing the scientific method. Through Beiruni and many Ibn al-Haytham and many others, and that's understood. There is another school when it comes to Islam and science, which you could say is the most superficial but most popular. Is this whole school of the scientific miracle in the Quran, what's called Ijaz Ilmi.
Someone just mentioned Maurice Bucaille.
Oh, they did, yeah.
So would you say he's the sort
of course. Maurice Bucaille is probably the most famous exponent.
Would you say he's the father of this sort of, or would you say the most popular influencer?
In the Western world, I think, or in the modern world, since the 70s or 80s, he's certainly probably the biggest influence on that school. But as Ihsanoglu and others point out, there were elements of that school in previous centuries. You look within the Muslim discourse. Occasionally, some of the Mufassirin would point to verses of the Quran and say.
But he's certainly the most well known in the West.
Yes, certainly, and of course, I think. Did you read his book?
I've got his book upstairs.
Did you ever read it?
No.
Okay. Well, maybe I'm a little bit older than you. I certainly read it cover to cover when I was about, 13, 14, and I was gripped because, in case readers are not aware, Maurice Bucaille was a French medic who wrote this book called The Quran, the Bible, and Science.
Yeah.
And what he argued was that the Bible has many unscientific statements or verses which go against science. For example, he said creation of the world in 6 days.
Yeah.
And he gave many examples of that. But then he went through the Quran. He said the Quran, he could not find any unscientific or anti-scientific statement in the Quran. But in fact, he went further than that. He said there are many things mentioned in the Quran which could not have been known 14 centuries ago, but which are actually, we know to be scientifically true today. So for example, there's a verse which could possibly refer to the expansion of the universe. There's a certain verse which talks about fingerprints, refers to fingerprints, and it does seem to imply the uniqueness of fingerprints.
What's the verse?
Bala qadirina ala nusawwiya banana. Surah Al-Qiyamah. When God is talking about the resurrection, it says, do people think we can't resurrect the dead? Nay, we are able to even to put together your fingertips.
I see. So
people argued, well, that's a reference to the
What do you make of this whole scientific miracle sort of where we...
So I was well into that. Many people...
I was well into that as well. Many people, it was a thing, It was the best response.
Millions still are, I would say, around the world. A lot of the popular preaching... It's popular preaching.
Yeah.
It works well to say, the Quran, our heritage, is so great that we had all these discoveries.
We predicted the fingerprint and all sorts of stuff.
But that's not true. But one of the biggest arguments against it is that largely Muslims did not predict anything like that. If it was all there, why didn't people find these discoveries? Secondly, there is a big danger, and it's already happened, that people start finding discoveries where they don't exist, and in fact they end up falsifying the Quran. I'll give an example of that. About 15, 20 years ago, some astronomers claim to have discovered 2 more planets in the solar system, because the solar system used to be 9 planets. It is now 8 planets ever since Pluto was demoted.
It's a moon, right?
No, it's called a dwarf planet.
Dwarf planet.
It's not big enough to be a full planet. So now I grew up learning the solar system has 9 planets. It now has 8 officially, but back in those days it was 9. And then some astronomers, as they often do, claim to have found a couple more planets. So one Muslim scientist, doctor in the UK, who was an activist, I remember him writing an excited letter to a Muslim newspaper or to the national newspaper saying, this discovery in the Quran already. Look at the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, Prophet Joseph, which has his dream. He sees the sun, the moon, and 11 planets. Right. He said, look, the discovery is here.
Yeah.
Now, several things we could say about this. Number one, Kawkab can mean planet. It can also mean a bright star. So those verses of Surah Yusuf are not necessarily, or they're certainly not clear cut. And also, the Greek meaning of planet includes the sun and the moon. So we can get into the interpretation of that. Secondly, if you claim that this discovery confirms this verse, what happens if we find more planets and there's 13 or 15. Yeah, or we decide no, there's actually only 8. You've just
come back down again. Yeah,
well,
yeah.
you just falsified the Quran actually. Because you have staked your claim that the Quran is definitely saying there's 11.
It's a very reactive way of interpreting it. Oh, we've got a verse for that. You know, it's just sort of.
Well, I think it's actually related to the colonial experience actually.
Yeah,
Because the very proud Muslim civilizations who were conquered, most of them from the 16th century, 17th century by Western Christian powers, and fell far behind in science.
Yeah.
To me, what sadly, the Muslim world used to be at the forefront of science in the medieval times. There's no doubt about that, and led the world and helped spark the Renaissance and everything. But then clearly fell into decline for the last 5 centuries or so. And of course, the Western world and the Japanese and many others, Indian, Chinese, many people are way ahead of the Muslim world. The Muslim world universities, there's very few in the top 100. I think the top 100 universities of the world, there's about 3 from Muslim majority countries. There's a few countries which have pretty good universities like Malaysia, Turkey, Iran, some good ones, Pakistan, sometimes there's 1 or 2 good ones. I mean, you can go up and down. But the point is, it's not very good. And to deal with that, what the Muslim majority world needs to do is work hard. And the government needs to invest more in science and technology, and standards have to be raised through hard work. And, that's slowly happening. We had a sister task force which looked at that science of the Muslim majority world and universities there. It needs hard work. It needs decades of that. And I'm confident that, the signs are there and people all around the world will rediscover science and technology. But sadly, the shortcut, the lazy way really, is to say, oh, this doesn't matter. Our scripture already has all these answers in there. We are ahead of everybody else. To me, it's a very a quick, easy way of reclaiming the high ground.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like a shortcut. Well, you guys worked for centuries on this. Well, we already knew it because it was already there. We just got to read it in this different. It's quite embarrassing actually.
And so that's a major school which which is very popular amongst the masses, which shouldn't be discounted. And then again, like I said, it falsifies the Quran. For example, there's this famous theory that if you take certain verses of the Quran and you look at numbers and put some ratios in, you can predict the speed of light, for example. Now, I looked into this very carefully, and I realized it is actual nonsense. But there is a coincidence that there are certain numbers in the Quran related to the Earth-Moon orbit and this, that, and the other, which if you do compare some ratios, you do get to a number very close to the speed of light. But there's no logical coherence whatsoever to that argument. Yeah. And of course, there is a fundamentalist Christian professor who wrote a stinging rebuke of that, and it makes Muslims look like fools, basically.
Yeah.
Professor Nadal Gassoum, also in his great book, Islam's Quantum Question, he has an appendix dealing with that issue. So that's one school which shouldn't be underestimated in the sense that it has a popular understanding. And I was just going to say the final one is the new generation. People like Professor Nadal Gassoum, who talks about an Averroesian synthesis based on Ibn Rushd, where you accept science as it is, universal science, empirically based, a scientific method which Muslims helped develop, and then the interpretation of that is left to you depending on your philosophical or religious framework. So what that means is that if we're scientists in a lab, a whole team of us, and we can be Muslim, Jewish, Christian, atheist, Hindu, Buddhist, whatever, existentialists, we can still do the science together because we agree on the scientific method, and we can build accelerators and do the experiments and the data. Now, whatever we discover about life or about the fundamental particles of nature or space and time or whatever, how you interpret that is outside science, and that's up to you. So you might see it as something sacred, as I do. So all these things are sacred, or as the signs of God. Whereas somebody else, as an atheist, for example, might not see that, or they might see beauty else, in it. They might see something else. But we can't insist that any of those are scientific conclusions because they're not. The scientific conclusions are only those based on the theory and experiment. And
so it's like separating what is scientifically provable and what is your own sacred, which is, I think, is great.
Yes, that's basically Professor Nidal's basic.
What's his name? So if I could write
Nidal, so Nidhal.
Nidhal.
Surname Gueussoum. Right? OUM.
OUM.
Yeah, Nidal Gassoum.
OUM.
Yeah, so he writes mainly in Arabic, but also in English and French because he's Algerian.
Yeah. Sorry, someone just angled it down a bit.
Origin.
Yeah.
And he and he teaches at the American University of Sharjah. He teaches physics and astronomy, cosmology. His father is the head of the Islamic Scholars of Algeria. When he was the chair of the head, so his father is a leading religious scholar, and Professor Nidal's contributions to the Islam and science debate are brilliant. I'd recommend him. Yeah.
So you mentioned Ibn Rushd, or Averroes, as some people might know him. What do you make of him? Because he was someone, the old painting. I think it's about Michelangelo or Da Vinci, where the School of Athens. He was the only Muslim guy who made the cut.
Yes.
So he's someone who even the sort of Western Renaissance sort of people had some sort of respect for, I believe.
Yes.
Within the Muslim world. What do you make of his role in the sort of in science, philosophy, sort of?
Well, Ibn Rushd, Averroes, is one of the intellectual giants of the Muslim world, and I think we should be proud.
Yeah.
And learn from all of these great giants. And in fact, in our task force, they were big followers of Ibn Rushd, Professor Nidal. Professor Nidal was the main one, but there are others, like, for example, Sheikh Afifi, whose presentation is on Imam Ghazali. So there were a few you might call Ghazalians. There were others who were big Akbarians, Sheikh al-Akbar Ibn Arabi, big fan of his. There was the professor from Iran was a big follower of Mullah Sadra, for example.
He's the Iranian, right?
Yeah. The kind of Shia mystical figure.
So,
and I thought that was great.
Different backgrounds.
And people quoted Ibn Taymiyyah as well because of his famous book on reason and revelation. So this is a very rich heritage. And Ibn Rushd, for example, he was a great jurist as well. His Bidayat al-Mujtahid was taught at traditional seminaries all around the world. But his short book I would recommend is called Faslul Maqal. It's on the harmonization of religion and philosophy. It's a short book by Averroes, and it's widely available in English. You'll find it online as well.
Okay.
I'd highly recommend that. And one of the things he argues in there, he says religion and philosophy, true philosophy. Remember, the word philosophy means the love of wisdom, philosophia. It's the love of wisdom, and that's true philosophy. And it's not just intellectual; it is practical as well.
Yeah.
But Ibn Rushd argues that religion and philosophy are both independent avenues to the truth and to God. And he bases that on a verse of the Quran as well, in fact, because he was a Hafiz of Quran. He was a Quran and Hadith scholar and of fiqh, jurisprudence, as well as philosophy. For those interested in this reason, revelation, religion, science, especially from a Muslim perspective, I'd strongly recommend Ibn Rushd's on the harmonization of religion and philosophy. Because modern science came out of philosophy, really. It used to be called natural philosophy. It wasn't called science before. And hence, Professor Nidal Ghassoon called his view an Averroesian synthesis.
Averroesian, that sounds pretty cool. I'm an Averroesian synthesizer. Whatever. So can I ask a question? How do you then reconcile certain sort of miracles that are in? So I know you haven't had your tea in a long time. It's probably cold. I can make you another one if you want.
No, later. Yeah, this will probably get cold, but this is more important.
Okay, sure. How do you reconcile miracles in the Quran and scientific claims? So, for example, when I was back in the days, I used to go for the more metaphorical understanding of miracles rather than the literal. So, for example, I don't know. Let's pick one.
The parting of the Red Sea.
Oh yes, let's start there. So, for example, Musa alayhi salam, or Moses, when he was being chased by Pharaoh's, I believe, army or whatever it was, his people, he came out a sea or an ocean, wherever it was, and he put down his staff, and through the power of God, the sea split. He went through the sea, and then it closed behind him, swallowing all the other people, sort of Pharaoh's people. Now, someone looks at that and says, "Oh, that's not possible." Now, for me, and I'm sure yourself, we know that when the moon is at a certain distance from the Earth, its gravity sort of pulls away or has an effect on the water, so it may split it. So my thing was, that's easily explainable. So it wasn't a miracle as such, but the miracle was in the timing of the split. That's the way I used to sort of get around miracles. What was your approach?
Yeah, so from a scientific background from a young age, I always inclined towards a rationalistic approach or naturalistic explanation of miracles. That these momentous events, which are in the Bible, of course, as well as in the Quran, that these happened through the natural laws of science, and as you said, the miracle was in the timing. So that's my view generally. That I try to stick to the literal meaning of the miracles, and find naturalistic explanation for them as far as possible, before resorting to say metaphorical interpretation.
That's interesting.
Which is possible, certainly in Arabic, a language like Arabic, like all great literature. A lot of Arabic and arguably much of the Quran is actually very metaphorical in nature anyway.
There's a lot of depth as well.
Yeah. So I mean, there are Christians and Jews and others who have, apparently they found chariot wheels on the seabed of the Red Sea, and that there is its profile. It has a shallow. It's shallow, very shallow at one point, because there is basically a highway underneath the waves, and if that story presumably would have been that there was some kind of tiny shift of the Earth's crust there, which allowed that channel under the water to rise, and the waters to literally part. But the fact that it happened when God commanded Moses to strike his staff into the sea is the miracle. Then the other one is Moses strikes his staff and you get 12 springs come out from under a rock, one for each of the tribes of Israel. Again, that's not too difficult to imagine a scientific explanation for that, in terms of layers of rock and aquifers and water trapped in between, and etc. The more difficult ones, I suppose, I think, like Moses' staff turning into a snake. I basically have no scientific explanation for that.
So
I don't know. And then there's things like splitting of the moon and this and that.
So just on the snake one, because I found this, you were speaking to my father earlier, and he's of this sort of opinion that you should look at miracles metaphorically. He's, a doctor, so he's like a science like yourself, not demeaning or anything. And he said that, I believe he was reading the tafsir by Muhammad Asad or someone else like that. We actually got Muhammad Asad here, if you in case you were.
Who was very rationalistic.
Yeah, very right. We can get it up if you want. It's up to you. We can do that. But he was saying that the metaphorical meaning of Moses turning his staff into a snake was because the Pharaoh brought like his magician, and he said, "Okay, well, I've got a magician that can do exactly the same thing." So he turned his staff into a snake, and the two snakes had a fight, and Moses' snake won.
Well, ate the other snake.
Ate the other snake. So his argument was that his sort of argument was metaphorical, like what Moses was trying to say to the Pharaoh was greater than what the Pharaoh could provide to him. So he was sort of trying to get around it in that way.
So Moses' argument swallowed the Pharaoh's magician's argument.
There you go. Something along those lines.
Yeah. So that Muslims who take a metaphorical view of these stories, that's the kind of argument they would come up with. It's also very interesting that even in the tradition, even the stories of the Quran, the Pharaoh has a whole load of magicians, not just one, and they all come. And Moses on his own, he's afraid, but he's.
And one by one, he.
No, he takes them all together.
Oh, together. Oh, okay.
And it says that they throw down their sticks and ropes, and they become moving snakes. And then Moses throws his stick, and it becomes a snake that swallows all the other snakes. Now, even in the traditional commentaries of the Quran, they mention the illusion, because there's a whole discussion as to whether magic is real or it's just all illusion. And there are different schools on that within the Muslim tradition, and there are some authorities who insist there is no reality to magic. It's all just illusion. And the traditional commentary mentioned that this was done on hot sand, and the magicians had dipped their ropes in mercury, which with the temperature heating on the hot sand, it made the ropes writhe. So it looked like snakes. Yeah, this is in the traditional centuries-old commentary. So people have understood that in different ways. With our task force, we had a couple of workshops in London before that, discussing some of these issues, smaller workshops. And one of my friends, actually, who's a young theologian, I suppose, he came up with a very interesting idea. He referred to some cartoon series, which I didn't know about. You may know it. A children's cartoon series, which is science fiction. And it imagined a world where the science fiction meant that we had learned so much that people were able to manipulate quantum packets. And we know, modern physics, the new physics, everything is made up of tiny quanta. We're talking about space and time and matter. And these are the tiniest, kind of pieces, if you like, of the fabric of the universe. And this science fiction cartoon series had people who were able to manipulate those quantum packets and were therefore able to do all kinds of incredible things, turn one substance into another very quickly, and do shape shifting and God knows what. And my friend argued that, and he's a very rationalist, by the way, but he said, if you could get to that level and manipulate quantum packets, you could easily turn a stick into a snake, into a living snake, which was a very interesting idea. It still sounds very far-fetched, but I love these discussions about this. I think we should be open. I don't have the answers to all of these questions.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
Difficult questions. I think the most important thing is to be intellectually curious and learn, and I think celebrate the successes of science and science fiction and the horizons it opens up, but also realize that the tradition is very rich as well. As I said, the commentaries on the Quran on these stories have been very rich. The Muslims are generally open to all kinds of possibilities before, and when that gets closed down and there's only one interpretation of the Quran for everything,
next question.
Dangerous.
I want to revisit some miracles in a bit, but my question is: you were saying like the earlier sort of scholars or commentators on the Quran, they sort of had this idea that the sand was hot and they had mercury and all these sort of explanations to these miracles. How are those early voices been shut down? Why is it that if you were to go into any mosque randomly and ask any imams, say, "Oh, what can you tell me about the snake story?" He would give you a literal interpretation of the story. And why have these voices been lost? Where have they gone? How has this happened?
Yeah, it is a tragedy. My feeling is, having studied the physical sciences, to PhD level, and also, by the grace of God, having studied all the traditional Islamic sciences, is that there was a loss of the knowledge of science, actually, literally. And also, as we said, the Muslim world fell behind the rest of the world, and from about the Renaissance time onwards and the time of the scientific revolution. And so the Muslim world lost out because that's when scientific knowledge increased exponentially. Before that, arguably, it was very steady increase from the ancient medieval world. But after the scientific revolution, scientific knowledge has really got accelerated, exponential increase. So people have been left very far behind. So, for example, when I read the commentaries which say the ropes were dipped in mercury, I've got a good idea of what that means because I know a bit about physics and chemistry. A lot of traditional ulama in the seminaries and the Al-Azhars and other places may not know anything about the physics or chemistry of mercury. They may not even know what that word means. It refers to a substance. And so they won't remember that or absorb it or understand its significance.
They might just dismiss it.
So just ignore it and just stick to a literal.
So how is it that the earlier commentators knew about this kind of stuff?
Well, the great commentators were familiar with Greek science, for example. They were very interested in that. So, for example, you look at Ibn al-Qayyim, with a student of Ibn Taymiyyah, and actually, quite literalist, but very spiritual. But in his, he writes about medicine a lot. He was very interested in spiritual healing, but he quotes Hippocrates and who's the other chap? The other ancient Greek or Roman medic, who's the other one? Sorry, Galen.
Okay.
Galen. Jalinus, they call him in Arabic.
Jalinus, okay.
And Hippocrates is Bokrat.
Right.
Yeah. So Ibn al-Qayyim in some of his books quotes him a lot. Ibn Taymiyyah, I've translated some of his stuff on moon sighting because that's an issue of science and religion. Ibn Taymiyyah was familiar with the latest mathematical model at his time in the 14th century to predict the visibility of the moon, for example.
Wow.
And he gave his view based on that. A lot of people, they read, translated into Arabic, the knowledge of the Greeks, the Romans, and other disciplines, and a lot of that knowledge had come into the Muslim world, through its expansion and through all the people of different backgrounds living within the Muslim empires. So, there's a lovely hadith which says the wisdom is the lost property of a believer, or the lost camel of the believer. Al-hikmatu dalatul mu'min. And wherever the believer finds it, he or she has most right to it. In other words, search for the truth, and when you find truth, or accept it.
Yeah.
The companion of the Prophet said, accept the truth from wherever it comes.
Yeah.
Because truth has lights associated with it. فَإِنَّ عَلَى الْحَقِّ نُورًا.
Yeah.
And that's based on the hadith where even Satan tells the truth sometimes, even the devil tells the truth sometimes. And the Prophet says to his companion, who was Abu Hurairah, I think he said, صَدَقَكَ وَهُوَ كَذُوب. He told you the truth even though he's an absolute liar. But even the devil sometimes tells the truth. So the point is, you accept the truth from wherever it comes because it has light. Truth is light. Thomas Jefferson, by the way, in his writings, he uses the word light a lot. He's referring to knowledge when he's talking about how the new American Republic will open up the vistas of knowledge. It's very interesting. He uses the word light, which Imam Shafi used in the Islamic tradition way before. But the point is, don't dismiss something because it comes from somebody you don't like, even if it's Satan. If you're a true believer in God, God is truth in the Quran. Al-Haq is one of the names of God. Wherever truth is coming from, a true seeker of truth accepts that from wherever it is.
Fair enough. I've got a question here from Mohsin Lala, who says, which verses of the Quran does Dr. Usama think prove the book's compatibility, I think, with evolution theory?
Or
Comparability.
Well, there's many actually. Read our report, I would say. We give many examples. So, for example, there are verses which say that God created human beings in stages, that God created creation, plants and animals in stages. There is one verse, Surah Nuh, for example, Wallahu anbatakum min al-ardi nabata. Surah Nuh, the short chapter called Noah.
NUH, right?
Yeah, Surah Nuh. Wallahu anbatakum min al-ardi nabata, which means God made you grow out of the ground like plants.
Really?
For example, now
that's amazing.
Yeah, so I can't contradict myself. So I can't say this is the only meaning. So all of these verses have been interpreted differently at different times. I gave examples of that at the end of my lecture at the Dean Institute, by the way, and that snippet is a separate YouTube video. So refer to that. I think we just should be honest. Well, these verses have been manipulated. They've been understood naturally according to the current scientific knowledge of that time. And to my mind now, as a modern scientist reading an ayah which says God made you grow out of the earth like plants, to me, think, well, hold on, that sounds like evolution. But I must stress that I don't believe in evolution because there's verses which may refer to it. I believe in evolution as a scientist because the scientific method and the overwhelming scientific evidence points to it as a scientific fact. And that's a principle we learned from the early Muslims, as Nidal Qasim and others show in the books. Al-Bayruni, Ibn al-Haytham, all the great early Muslim scientists and philosophers and religious authorities understood this. Ahmad Dalal has written a brilliant book on that. He gives very detailed examples, but he showed this point that the early Muslims were very clear that matters of science have to be proved by scientists through experimentation, observation, gathering the facts, and they supported that. And religion should stay out of that. Religious authorities have no business
to tamper in that sort of process.
Tamper or try to say you can't believe this, you can't believe that, or you can't
let them get on with
research this. Which is what some of the other side did at the Dean Institute debate. But they knew that they had to stick to the main function of religion, which is to help people live good, moral, sacred lives, to be good people and to know God. It's about morality, ethics, spirituality, etc. And leave science to the scientists.
Could I offer something I came across when I was reading the Quran some time ago with evolution, is that when, like you said, God created human beings in stages, but also the story of that God created Adam in its sort of human flesh form, and he left him there, and Satan used to come and look at Adam and say, what is this thing? He was sort of curious about this thing, what is Adam? And then after some time, God blew his own spirit into Adam, and that's when he became a human being with consciousness and whatnot. So when I looked at that verse, metaphorically, I was looking at it and saying that our early ancestors who did not have the cognition or that sort of brain capacity were symbolized in God creating Adam in the human flesh and him lying there. Now, after some certain time, God's spirit, i.e. our ability to think, our ability to reason, blew into us, as in via God or via evolution or whatever you want to call it. And that's when Satan becomes relevant, because that's when we can get temptations. That's when we're able to even know what is right and wrong. When you're sort of an animalistic form, there's no morals for lions and leopards or whatever it is, but there are morals for human beings. That's how I looked at it. And that was my sort of amateur sort of explanation or sort of interpretation of those things. Well, I mean, would you say that is way off or somewhere? I mean,
no, thank you for that. I hadn't thought of that myself.
Yeah.
I think that's a very good interpretation. That makes a lot of sense. Appeals to me. I should point out that's not a verse of the Quran. That's a hadith.
It's a hadith. Okay,
it's a hadith, and that's one of the issues here is that Muslims have to have a more robust, honest discussion about hadith of all types. Even in the supposedly the most authentic collections. So, for example, I'm from an Ahl al-Hadith background, strong pro-Hadith background, revering the 6 books, especially Bukhari and Muslim. But we have to admit there are issues. For example, the Hadith transmitted by Imam Bukhari repeatedly, and I think Imam Muslim as well, but Imam Bukhari's Hadith about Hazrat Aisha being 6 when she was married to the Prophet and the marriage being consummated at 9. It's all around us in the Western world. That Hadith is causing us huge problems.
How would you address that, or how would you?
Well, there are many other commentators that pointed out problem with the chain of narration and circumstantial evidence about the age of her sister Asma and her age at the Battle of Badr and Uhud, and what other hadiths say, which say that it doesn't make any sense. She cannot have been 6 and 9 at the age of marriage. She must have been older, probably
19,
16 and 19.
16, 19.
So that's my view. But the point is, I think that illustrates that something had gone wrong somewhere, even in the supposedly most authentic hadith books. Now, coming back to your question, I think the spirit. This is another traditional picture. Coming back to the first question, why do a lot of Muslim scholars deny human evolution? It's because, again, the Quran does say God created Adam, human beings from clay and water, etc., from earth, and then blew his own spirit into him. Now, a lot of people think, and God said be, and he was. And a lot of people think, well, that must have happened instantaneously. So there was this kind of, like a clay statue, and then God breathed into it, and it became a living human being. But there is no need to accept that at all, because kun fayakun, be and it is. If we think about it, no Muslim actually thinks that it's always instantaneous. The good example is Jesus Christ. God says about Isa bin Maryam, Jesus Christ, that God created him through the word, kun fayakun, be, and he was. But every Muslim actually accepts Mary's pregnancy, 9-month pregnancy. So it wasn't like that, exactly. Now, so why should that be true of Adam? And in fact, there's something I read from Ibn Arabi which clinched it for me. As I said, I knew all of these traditional objections to evolution, and I had to find good answers for every single one before I came out in public and said, look, I'm very clear that evolution is not against the Quran, or the Quran is not against evolution. And on that one, based on something Ibn Arabi says, the breathing of the spirit doesn't have to be instantaneous either. It refers to the gradual development of intelligent organisms.
And brain, or whatever you want to call it.
So it starts from the Big Bang, or beyond that, all the way through to the first emergence of life, and then more and more complex life, more and more organic life. Like that, eventually you get to increasing complexities of humanoid or hominid creature, and eventually we get to the human being. Now, Adam is special because he's taught the names of God, and so the creation of Adam is special. In a sense, he's the first full human being. The breathing of the Spirit of God has reached its pinnacle in him. His spiritual and intellectual faculties are at their height. He is a full human being. That's why he receives the names from God, etc. So there is a lot of, I think, very profound and spiritual and sacred teachings to this. And evolution helps us with that. I mean, as you begin to see the power of God, the more you learn about biology and evolution and stuff, and how God is created, or how living systems develop and adapt, etc. It is mind-boggling. I have a good friend, a British well-known TV presenter, actually, who told me, he was brought up as a Christian. He became an agnostic, like many people in this country, for a long time. He said evolution has brought him back to the brink of faith. He's very close to faith, and evolution has brought him back. He reads about all this stuff, and he just says, wow, there must be something beyond. This is sacred. And I've met a number of Muslims who either lost their faith or are about to lose their faith because of the evolution question.
Wow. And
by the grace of God, when we presented our arguments for evolution, that helps them actually.
It calmed a lot of people down.
Keep their faith.
Yeah, absolutely. Could I please let me know how you're doing? If I'm asking too many questions or whatever.
No, I love this discussion.
I'm loving it as well. Every time you say something, I feel like 3 other questions pop in my head. with regards to one miracle, when I was reading the Quran, I could not find a way out, and that is the virgin birth. Naturalistically, I was like, I couldn't get a way out. Metaphorically, I was like, where do I go with this? So how I've really struggled with that one. I really did struggle with the virgin birth. How is it possible on one side to say science and reason and rationality and evidence? On the other hand, I'm saying 2,000 years ago, there was a woman who gave birth to a child without any male intervention.
So I'm with you. I have
no idea.
I have no explanation either.
Could I? Fair enough. I mean, honesty. My father.
So I leave that an unresolved question.
Unresolved question.
Yeah, because, you know, as I said, we know so much about DNA.
Yeah.
Mapped out the human genome, etc. So we know the science, and it's very well known how embryology, etc. Everything. And of course, the virgin birth it did not start with the Quran. The whole idea is with Jesus. It's obviously the Christian idea. But before that, we know that various Roman pagan
they had this similar
the Mithraic teaching, all that. The idea of virgin birth was there in many cultures before Christianity and Islam. No, I don't.
Did you think it's somewhat borrowed, or I mean, like that idea?
Well, as I said, I honestly don't know. I honestly don't know. It's true to say that the Quran echoes a lot of stories in the Bible, Old and New Testament, but because devout Muslims like myself believe that the Old Testament and New Testament, but the Bible, the essential teachings are also from God, the revelation from the Quran.
Yeah,
it's not a problem when the Quran echoes stories of the Bible. But yeah, scientifically, that's one of the unresolved questions.
So my father, who was speaking to before, told you about what's his name again? The guy he was talking about.
Pervez.
Yeah. He said it wasn't a virgin birth, and he's using the Quran. Now he said when God says to Mary, "You will have a child," and so on and so forth, and she goes, "Oh, how can I have a child? I have not been touched by any man." And then he said, "Oh, my own, according to my methods or whatever, you will have a child." Now he's saying that method
is the normal one.
Is the normal one.
Right. So
I mean, this is his sort of. I'm paraphrasing what.
Well, that's you see, to me, this illustrates how this chap was, born in the early 20th century in a very traditional Indian
Pakistan,
Pakistan.
Pakistan.
Yeah. I mean, he would have been born before partition.
Yeah.
In a part of the world not known for its scientific literacy, but this shows again the depth of Islamic scholarship. That he would have been aware of the fact that Quran had always had a wide range of interpretation, and he from what you say, came up with an interpretation where it seemed to be, or it didn't seem to contradict science in the way that the virgin birth apparently seems to contradict modern science. But I will mention one thing because life is short, and of course I've given up on worrying about flak and threats and all that. And it's something from the tradition. Shah Waliullah, probably the greatest Muslim intellect from India.
Yeah. And
somebody from Delhi, where my ancestors are from, and also in our spiritual, intellectual hadith tradition, I've changed the narration against Shah Waliullah. He's a great man. He was strongly influenced by Ibn Arabi. But in one of his books, he says something very curious about that. You don't forget the angel who comes to Mary to tell her that she's going to have a child and also breathe the spirit into her is sent in the form of a man, of a perfect man almost, or a very fulsome man according to the Quran. It's in Surah Maryam, the chapter on Mary. فَأَرْسَلْنَا إِلَيْهَا رُوحَنَا فَتَمَثَّلَ لَهَا بَشَرًا سَوِيًّا. Our spirit, the spirit of God, Gabriel in this case, came to Mary in the form of a handsome human being, right? And then other verses of the Quran then say he's the one who blew the spirit into Mary.
Is that a euphemism for?
Well, no, we know what Shah Waliullah says.
Yeah.
Shah Waliullah says, and this is why you don't read quite graphic what he says,
right,
in one of his books, but it's not for everybody. Sure. He says that Gabriel literally breathed into the private parts of Mary.
Wow.
Right? And he talks about the moistness in his breath. He says, because the breathing, when you breathe, there's moisture, it's not just air, there's a bit of water. And he says, and of course, human beings are created from water. And water is the source of life, in the Quran says, so he said that moistness coming from the Spirit of God in human form in Mary's womb, the word he uses, eventually develops into a human being. So, I mean, this is Shah Waliullah. I mean, this is not some modernist. Shah Waliullah is a Sufi. He's a Quran and Hadith master. He's from Delhi, as we said, born in the beginning of the 18th century.
It was well before.
And so it's not wrong, in my view. The most important thing is not wrong to think through some of these stories and see what other interpretations are possible from the breadth of the Arabic language and the depth of it. So yeah, I mean, I think, like with anything, it should be possible to have different interpretation of the virgin birth.
And do you think that there's an attitude, I would say, since you said like post-colonialism, that we would reject the more scientific / metaphorical interpretation and go with the more literal, because we don't want to be appearing to be more Western or whatever it is. We don't want to be like, for example, Sir Syed Ahmed in India. He said he was an educationalist, and he actually radically changed his views. He was a very he wrote a whole essay on are the mangoes halal, because mango is a fruit or whatever that did not originate in Arabia. So should you eat it because the Prophet didn't eat it? A long essay, whatever. And then he said, no, you shouldn't. But then he changed his mind and he changed his whole perspective, and he became educationalist. He said, listen, he went to Europe and goes, these guys are doing something right? Fine, they're taking over us, but something in the societies they are doing correct, and we need to learn from them. Now, he was called, he's a stooge, or he's a Garfield, or he's a this, he's an X and Y, because he recognized, even though they are taking over us, something within this society, something within their method and culture is correct, and we should learn from that. So the more metaphorical or interpretations of the Quran that seem to be in line with modern science, it seems the more hardliners will say, oh, you're just pandering towards the West, you're just pandering towards those people. Why are you trying to sell out to those guys? Do you think there's that attitude that exists? And which is why these interpretations maybe are not taken seriously or even acknowledged.
Yes, I think this is a large part of the problem. There is this perception, this idea of Western science. We talked about that before.
Abdul Salam,
So there are people who reject, for example, very precise calculation for the sighting of the moon done by devout Muslim scientists.
Yeah.
Who say these are Western calculations. I've heard that term.
Western.
How can you trust or kafir calculation? How can you trust the calculation of the kuffar
with kafir numbers and kafir calculations? Yeah, of course.
Which is ridiculous. So that is an element of it, and sadly, that's part of the world. Sadly, there was a colonial period, but we have to. I think as Muslims, if we claim to be, to claim to be a Muslim is a very exalted claim. It's saying you are in total submission to God, following the example of the last messenger of God on earth, the greatest human being ever. In the Islamic tradition, who's the brother of all the great prophets. It's a very high claim. So Muslims, we set ourselves a very high standard. So we've got to keep to a high standard in our intellectual and spiritual discourse. And it's not good enough to say, well, it comes from the West, therefore it must be wrong.
I mean, we shouldn't let
we said that earlier. Even if it comes from Satan, if Shaitan says something correct, if Shaitan says to you 2 + 2 = 4, you're going to say, well, it can't be.
Of course, nonsense.
I'm going to believe to its face. So.
Nonsense, absolutely. Someone here has they asked a very good question. I mean, by the way, guys, I know you're asking so many questions, and we're trying to get through all of them. So bear with me. We will try and get through as many questions as possible. But someone was saying that as you mentioned earlier, that you are Ahlul Hadith. So that means people of background, that's your background. So how do you? I think someone was saying about how do you reconcile the literalism within the Hadiths and your scientific approach? And the Hadiths are, as we know, more problematic scientifically and morally than the Quran are. So how do you square that sort of circle?
So the one thing about studying the Hadith tradition in great detail is there was immense dispute right from the beginning as to whether these hadith are authentic or not, and then if they are authentic, what do they mean? And there's a wide variety of views because they're in classical Arabic, just like the Quran. So just like verses of the Quran have many different interpretations. Same is true of the hadith, and we should revive those discussion and debates. So, for example, it's a classical position from some of the early muhaddithin to say that a verse that seems to contradicts the Quran has to be discarded, no matter how strong the chain of narration. That's not a new modernist viewpoint that people say. It was a classical position. Another classical position was to say you give precedence to logic and rationality over interpretation of Quran or Hadith, because that's your interpretation. But certain logical, rational, scientific kind of facts can't be disputed. So it is the Ahlul Hadith or the Muhaddithin, the Hadith scholars themselves, for centuries, really their commentaries on the Hadith. They had different viewpoints. I'll give you one example which springs to mind, which a biologist reminded me of after the evolution lecture, or told me about actually, to be honest, which is the famous Hadith which say that God created Adam 60 cubits high, which would make him 60 or 100 foot high, right? And again, it's in Bukhari and stuff. It says that Adam was 60 or 100 foot high, and then human beings have been steadily decreasing in height ever since, right? And again, that hadith is quoted sometimes by Muslims to say evolution must be wrong, because evolution tends to talk about height the other way. Now, Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, who's one of the greatest traditional hadith scholars, who wrote the massive commentary, the most popular commentary on Sahih al-Bukhari, on that hadith, he mentions basically the areas of Petra. Petra and Madain Saleh in northern Saudi Arabia are traditionally understood to be the dwellings of the Thamud people, who are mentioned again and again in the Quran.
The Thamud people, who are these? The
Thamud, the people of the Prophet Saleh.
Okay.
These are Arabs, right? Saleh was an Arab prophet. Petra was built by the Nabatean Arabs, whose history is fascinating. Jordanians and people who've been to Petra know all about that. And they've got the amazing carved homes and palaces and temples into the rock. I was just there last year. Incredible place. Ibn Hajar was familiar with this, and he says that there is a problem here. That's all he says. He doesn't solve the problem. He said there is a problem here. He says these homes of these ancient people, their doorways are the same size as our doorways, right? And their homes are the same size as our homes. And he says this implies that they were the same size as us. He says, however, this hadith seems to say that ancient people were much taller than us. He doesn't solve the problem, but he does raise it.
He asks an interesting question.
He asks a question.
That's very good.
And we have to revive that curiosity and say, well, hold on, perhaps there's a mistake in the transmission of this hadith. Perhaps
it means something we're
the
not.
hadith is Israelite. We know a lot of hadiths came from Jewish and Christians' teachings, and they were put into the mouth of the Prophet. So they call it Israeliyat in the Islamic tradition. Israelite narrations. They've come from the Bani Israel, the Israelites before us, and they need to be sifted out. In fact, very, very strangely, there was a Saudi scholar, a Saudi Salafi scholar, Sheikh Saleh al-Sadlan, who gave a fatwa saying you couldn't pray behind an imam who believed in evolution, which because somebody asked him that. They asked him this stage question, and that helped to kick off the problem at Masjid Tawheed. And I wrote about that on my blog, but the Guardian's Andrew Brown wrote a long piece about that as well. He interviewed me about it. But anyway, I actually spoke to the Sheikh on the phone at the time.
Oh, the Saudi one.
Yeah, the Saudi phone, because he's a well-known, respected traditional Sheikh in Saudi, and he'd known my father for a long time, and he was aware of this problem. And he himself said some of these hadiths on the subject of the creation of Adam, like the one you mentioned earlier, he said these are Israelite hadiths, so don't worry about those. They came from the from Jewish and Christian sources, which means we kind of respect them, but we don't have to take them as gospel truth or Quranic truth. So that's what I would say. There's far more, not all the hadith scholars generally weren't all kind of narrow, literalist, superficial.
It's much more diverse and rich.
Yeah.
Great. I've got a question from Noman Zakir, who's given us €5. Thank you very much for the contribution. He's asked to ask you a question. Dr. Hasan, can you please talk about the status of apostates and homosexuals in religion? And can a Muslim marry an apostate or homosexual person? Thanks.
Okay, right. That's outside our topic quite a lot. But I've written about it in great detail about, say, if you read my essay, No Compulsion in Religion, I argue, La ikraha fi din is a major Quranic teaching, which means no compulsion in religion.
Yeah.
And it occurs straight after Ayatul Kursi, the greatest verse of the Quran, which means it's something very important. And it's unrestricted. The freedom of religion is an absolute basic right. And I argued as to why this whole idea of punishing or even killing apostates, came along in early Islam. It's not backed up by the original sources, and increasingly most of the top religious scholars of today accept that, and they all preach about that people have freedom of religion to leave Islam. When it comes to homosexuality, a lot of Muslims, like Jews and Christians used to be generally, and many still are in parts of the developing world anyway, would be very anti-homosexuality, etc. And that was based on the story of Lut alayhi salam, the Prophet Lot,
Sodom
and Gomorrah. And again, very interesting, a very early Quran authority called Al-Kisai, he argued that the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, the Prophet Lut, if you read the Quran carefully, is not talking about homosexuality at all. It is talking about gang rape of men.
That's why I thought
by men, because actually you read it carefully, the people of those people were clearly heterosexual according to the Quran, because their wives are mentioned, and the Prophet tells them, go to your wives. What are you up to? Now, they wouldn't have done that if they weren't heterosexual. It would have been a nonsense for a prophet of God to tell them to go to their wives if they weren't.
They didn't have any wives in the beginning.
And also if they weren't heterosexual. So
were they gang raping men?
They were gang raping men. That's the Quranic story. And again, this is not a new interpretation. Al-Kisai is one of the great authorities of Quran and Arabic from the 2nd century of Islam, very early. He mentioned that in his commentary on the Quran. So as I've argued, actually, and others have as well, that's really what that story is about. And my view on that is, again, based on the science as well, because I've known people, I've had friends who were lesbian or gay or whatever, and I ask them about these things. And you look at the scientific studies as well. This is a question. Are people who are gay
born like that, or
exactly born like that? That's their nature.
It's
to do with their genes, brain wiring, this and that, or are they going against their own nature? Now, a lot of what we might call homophobes would argue they are going against their own nature, and that's why it's a sin and they're going against God. But as far as I can see, all the scientific studies and research point to the fact that no, that is their nature, that's their natural inclination. And even though a small percentage of human beings generally, but that is their nature, and it would be completely wrong to discriminate against people on that basis. Because if God has created people a certain way, then how can he right to say, well, God is going to punish them for being who they are? So that's an interesting question. Thank you for that, because I think the issue of religion and science is related to it.
Yeah, absolutely. I've got a question here from AS who says, it's great to hear Sheikh mention Sufis, Ibn Arabi and Shah Waliullah. Hang on, where's it gone? What is your position? I think it was
on Sufism.
On Sufism, yeah. So what's your position on Sufism?
Oh yeah, so Sufism or Tasawwuf, and to give it the Quranic name Tazkiyah, which is purification of the soul, is one of the classic traditional Islamic sciences, and it basically refers to the purification, the development of the soul. That's basically what it is. The idea is that you learn various rituals and things, prayer, ablution, washing, fasting. You do all that. But the Quran is very clear. It's very clear once you see this and you start reading the Quran, that you were never supposed to do that soullessly. It was always supposed to be with the love of God, the love of fellow human beings, with the sense of the sacred, and to develop your heart and to, as the Quran says, get rid of the diseases of the heart. Selfishness, greed, hate, envy, jealousy, anger, revenge, all that kind of thing. That's what essentially Islam and all the major religions are about. And true Sufism, is that inner aspect of things. And I'm honored, as I said, to be part of the spiritual hierarchy of Shah Waliullah, who is one of the greatest scholars ever. But he came out of India and Delhi. We're very proud of. Our parents are.
He's your boy.
We're very honored just to have anything to do with him. But of course, he was heavily influenced by Ibn Arabi, who is known as Shaykh al-Akbar, the greatest Shaykh, and certainly the greatest writer on the metaphysics of the inner aspect, and in my view, the greatest commentator on the Quran. And very interestingly, Ibn Arabi's entire teaching is based on the Quran and Hadith, lots and lots of Hadith. Takes them very literally as well sometimes. So, for example, he talks about God is beautiful and loves beauty a lot. He especially talks about the Hadith where we're created in God's image. So it's not just in the Bible. and it talks about being created in the image of the merciful.
Mm.
All the hadith and Quranic ayats which put mercy on top. That is Ibn Arabi's essential teaching.
Yeah.
And it's very important to, especially today, with Islam having such a bad press, really, for Muslims to remember that the root of our religion is mercy, a loving mercy, a rahmah. And it's my view that if we realize that, it solves a lot of the problem, because we present and kind of act and live Islam differently.
Absolutely. And someone's asking you here, does Dr. Usama Hasan read Shia hadith?
So I have to acknowledge that's a big hole in my knowledge. It's outside my expertise.
Yeah.
I know very little about the Shia hadith tradition.
Yeah.
I've been steeped in the Sunni hadith tradition. But from the little I've read, I do know that a lot of Sunni and Shia hadiths are common.
Yeah.
Because I hear the same teachings from some of my Shia friends. I've read them in Shia books. What's well known is that generally the chains of narration are different, of course, the way Sunni and Shia are separated. So you've got the well-known Sunni books, Malik, and then the Sikhs books, and many others, dozens. And they're different to the Shia early sources of hadith. There are occasionally there are quite a few narrators who are common, especially in the early generations. And also the principles of criticism, there's clearly overlap, because there's a lot of similarity in how they analyze the hadith and stuff, and also the fiqh. But when there's question about Shiite theology or jurisprudence, I will always refer to one of my Shia friends and say, sorry, I have very little knowledge of that. Yeah.
I've got an interesting question here by Imran Ali, who says, Dr. Usama Hasan, why do some Salafis call Ibn Arabi and Rumi kafir?
Good question.
There is this thing, like, they don't recognize Ibn Arabi, Rumi.
Yeah, so
these very sort of.
It's not just the Salafis, though. You know.
Who is it? Who else would?
Oh no, people right across the spectrum do that. If you look at the tradition, these guys were called kafir during their own time. Imam Bukhari was called a kafir. Imam Ghazali was. Ibn Taymiyyah was.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
It's well known. Basically,
is it like a badge of honor?
Yeah. Basically, the conclusion I've come to, I think it's very clear. Just as all the great prophets of God were persecuted and ridiculed themselves. So, you look at Jesus Christ, John the Baptist, the Prophet Muhammad himself, peace be upon them all, Moses. People were ridiculed because great people with great spirit and intellect, sadly, a lot of people around them don't realize their greatness. And, as the Arabs say, they say it in Latin as well, if you're ignorant of something, you oppose it.
Yeah.
So all great people, sadly, are opposed by people who are nowhere near their level. And that's what happened to all the great scholars. Now, so a lot of the fuqaha, or the formal exoteric theologians and jurists, also do takfir of Ibn Arabi and Rumi and stuff, because they're talking about spiritual mysteries which you come in the higher levels of Sufism, the quite complex mysteries about God and the world, and how everything is sacred, and how everything is a sign of God, and how God is intimately linked to everything that God has created, so everything is sacred. Some of their writing starts to sound pantheistic, right?
Monism, like I am God.
Monism. Exactly.
Monism.
Hallaj was crucified possibly for saying that I am God. And Bistami earlier on, an early Sufi said, glory be to me.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, but what they were saying was that we are created in God's image, and God breathed his soul into his spirit to us. They were talking about that spirit within them, right? That's basically what they meant when they said, I'm the truth, or glory be to me. Now, it's not just the Salafis. They may be the loudest nowadays, but people right across the Sunni and Shia spectrum, you read the controversies throughout history, the books pro those people and the books against them. It's right across. It's true to say maybe some of the Salafis are the loudest.
They do control a lot of the narrative.
Yeah, anyway. But it's true of many of the Divandi's and others as well. But let's. And by the way, I found in my own Ahl Hadith tradition, going back to Shah Waliullah and Shah Waliullah himself, he revered both Ibn Arabi and Ibn Taymiyyah, for example. So did Imam Alusi and others. So they were able to take all of the, especially the exoteric learning of Ibn Taymiyyah, Ibn Qayyim and others. Well, Ibn Qayyim is, but they were spiritual and others. Yes. But they were able to reconcile that with the really advanced Sufi teaching of Ibn Arabi. So there's no need to conflict the two, actually.
Fair enough. I've got a question here from Mike, who says, he said Islam says go to the truth wherever it leads you. What if it leads you out of Islam?
That's a great question. I certainly advise people, to be genuine truth seekers and to follow your heart, and to follow your heart. Ibn Rushd says the same thing, because he said, well, I'm talking about just following the truth. He says, the famous hadith and Quranic principle that you're not responsible for anything that you're coerced into doing, right? Anything done under coercion is not valid, yeah? You're not responsible for it, right? Ibn Rushd says in that book that I mentioned, he says an intellectual is coerced into his conclusions. And intellectuals, or scholars, learned people, start with certain premises and things, and then they absorb various data, and based on that, they, especially logically, they force from one conclusion to another. And even if they get it wrong, completely wrong, he said, they must be forgiven by God, because they had no option. They're coerced.
You
can't escape your conclusion. An incredible thing to say, like 1,000 years ago, whatever it is.
Absolutely.
900 years ago. So, of course, I have friends who've left Islam, or who've left other religions. I firmly believe in God, and I do believe true religion is good for you. What I'd say to them is, you followed your heart. It's taking, good luck, but carry on searching. Of course, I do hope and pray that they will actually return, find God. Obviously, I have to say that as a believer, but I can only talk to people.
But you wish them well.
I believe they're genuine. They're being sincere. They're being sincere. They're following their heart, and that needs a lot of courage.
I think you're right. It does take a lot of courage to think as an individual, as opposed to sort of saying, well, he's saying it, so I'll just go along with the crowd, and I don't want to be pressured or anything like that. But you had a lot of courage saying, I believe in evolution, and a lot of your other positions as well. So I suppose it makes sense.
So coming back to the question, that's why, to be honest, with a heavy heart because of my own beliefs, but this is why I support people. I support the right of people to leave the faith, and that's why I have a number of friends who left Islam, and good luck to them. And the most important thing is to be a good person, whether you're a Muslim or not, or an ex-Muslim, or whatever religion you are, whatever it is. There's no excuse really for being rude and nasty and horrible to other people. That's the bottom line. And the good humanity is the basis for all religions.
Exactly. We've got so many questions coming in. Is it okay if I throw a few that we ask you a few, then you can answer them how you want? Do you believe in that the Prophet split the moon in half, literally? I've got an understanding of that also that my dad told me about, so maybe we can discuss that if you want. How are we doing for time, by the way? I know you got to go back, so
I think as long as you
I can drop you wherever you want.
You have the energy. I think I'll carry on until I feel I'm going to drop.
Okay, that's great. If you need a break as well, we can have a break as well, or whatever it is. I know we ask you so many different questions from all different angles. But yeah, so what do you think of the moon splitting? We've got, what do you think of Islam in South Asia? Hassan Radwan says, much love to my Sheikh Usama. He's my spiritual guide. So
that's an honor.
So yeah, let's.
Much love in return.
Much love in return, of course.
Sheikh Hassan.
Sheikh Hassan, yes, of course. So we've got moon splitting, and we've got Islam in South Asia. To do with moon splitting, my father, I don't know where he got it from, said that the moon was the symbol or the insignia of the Quraysh. So when he split the moon in half, what he meant was that he broke the dominance and the stranglehold of the Quraysh. That's the interpretation I went with. And by the way, I said this. I went to Muslim school for 3 years, and I said this to my sheikh, to the Islamic Studies teacher, and he pulled me outside the class after everyone had gone. He goes, "Wait," he goes, this thing you said, you shouldn't say that. And I said, "Oh, shit." And me knowing the kind of person he is, he's not going to accept it. So, I said, "Oh, sheikh, but I was just exploring different ideas, and I thought this is a more rational interpretation." And blah blah blah. He goes, "Listen, these are very dangerous ideas, and you shouldn't you shouldn't mess around with them." I said, "Oh, okay, shit."
So you were a rebel, is it?
I was a rebel. I was
like me.
Yeah, I used to get sent out of the Islamic Studies and Arabic class all the time without fail. I used to wear it as a badge of honor. But I mean, what do you think of the moon splitting?
Well, first of all, thank you. I'd not heard that explanation before, but it sounds very plausible, actually. As far as I know, that is entirely true. That the
if it's true,
the Quraysh had the symbol of the moon, and
when you split the moon in half,
etc. Now, so اقتربت الساعة وانشق القمر. That's the very striking, very eloquent first verse of Surah Al-Qamar. Right? It says the hour has come near, meaning the day of judgment, the end of the world. The hour has come near, and the moon has split. Incredibly eloquent verse. When you recite it, especially in a large mosque or something. It's it gives you goosebumps, as we say, and makes your legs turn to jelly. And it's an amazing surah. The rest of the surah, it really is a surah of awe, of majesty, followed by Surah Al-Rahman, which is the surah of beauty. But anyway, so of course there's a literal interpretation, which you find in some of the hadiths, that the Prophet pointed at the moon, and it literally, the full moon is split in two parts, and the Quraysh could see half of it on each side of the valley, and then it recombined. Now, I think we have to ask the question, as I've said, even Sahih al-Bukhari in places, some hadith are suspect, like the hadith of Aisha, right? So did this really happen at the time when recorded? Was it made up later, based on a literal understanding of the verse of the splitting of the moon? The people took it very literally, and they kind of made up a story that's how it happened. Other friends have told me that some commentators said it was an illusion again, that Angel Gabriel placed his wing in the middle of the moon or something.
It looked like it was.
I'll just mention something which is...
some more water, sorry.
Yes, please.
Yeah, sorry.
I'll mention something which I know from astronomy, is that in the late 19th century, I believe it was, not far from here, on a hilltop in Kent, we believe, a group of people were observing the night sky as they do, and they suddenly saw the crescent moon, a large kind of waxen crescent moon, writhing and shaking and writhing and spitting fire. So bolts of fire coming out of it, and they got very scared. This is recorded in the annals there, and they went and reported it, and they were mocked and ridiculed, I think in the local paper and this and that. But some decades later, the astronomers have realized that what they saw was accurate. It was probably a large meteor strike on the moon, and which would have caused all kinds of flames to come out and this and that, and they accept that. So, sometimes people see things which you may mock, but which may well be true. And I don't know. Somebody do the physical model. If some cataclysmic kind of cause made the moon literally split in half, would it recombine under gravity? I'm not an expert in that type of physics, but my initial feeling is if a planet or a body like the moon split in half, surely it would actually recombine under gravity. That's just some basic physics I'm talking about. But there could be a metaphorical meaning, and certainly many verses of the Quran, like I said before, are very poetic. Arabic is a poetic kind of language, and the Quran would reveal to people who are masters of poetry. And that ayah, my father taught me this, that the Quran is not poetry, because the Quran says it's higher than poetry. You see it saying the Prophet is not a poet. His enemies called him a poet sometimes. The Quran is higher than poetry, but some of the verses, sound very poetical, and certainly that is one. The hour has come near, and the moon has split. What does that mean? And in classical Arabic, there are possibly other meanings to that, as to that needs to be researched. There are many metaphors like that. I actually don't know if there's a metaphorical meaning to the splitting of the moon. I should look into that, I suppose. What I do know is another verse about the Day of Judgment says, يَوْمَ يُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ وَيُدْعَوْنَ إِلَى السُّجُودِ. The day that the shin is laid bare, and people are invited to prostrate. Now, this is well known in the commentaries of the Quran. Certain hadiths say that God bears his shin, and then everybody has to prostrate to God, right? A very literalist, anthropomorphic.
That's why some people say that God actually has a shin.
Yeah. The whole discussion of the divine attributes and things comes in. But that verse doesn't mention God's shin at all. It just says the shin is laid bare. And as Abdullah Yusuf Ali and other commentators of the Quran point out, يَوْمَ يُكْشَفُ عَنْ سَاقٍ is an Arabic phrase. The day the shin is laid bare refers to the day when things get tough, basically. It's talking about how the Day of Judgment is very tough. And I have a strong feeling that that the moon has split. وَانشَقَّ الْقَمَرُ is a metaphorical, proverbial statement, and it's related to the coming of the hour. اقتربت الساعة. Things are coming close. It's very dramatic. Very dramatic.
The moon is split.
The hour, the end of time is nearly here. Time is about to end.
Absolutely.
And the moon is split. Now, I don't know. Confess my ignorance. What does the splitting of the moon mean?
And Islam in South Asia? Would you? I mean, that was a very broad question.
Yeah, very broad. Well, I always try to talk about the positives because people will often talk about the negatives and the cultural and narrow-mindedness. But Islam in South Asia is great. I mean, you have a lot of great stuff there. You have a lot of learning, a lot of very wise and learned people. You have a lot of the great saints.
You mentioned Shah Waliullah.
Shah Waliullah and many others.
Bulleh Shah,
of course,
the
great Sufi poet, Punjabi,
of course.
the Punjabi one, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
I remember being in an interfaith meeting where a Sikh leader in this country was quoting Bulleh Shah, talking about
that's amazing.
You can break objects but never break a person's heart. That's the first rule. That's from Bulleh.
Absolutely.
So there is so much positive, and I have to say, actually, while we're on this, in contemporary Islam, sometimes there's a tendency for Arabs only to try to dominate and monopolize discussion of Islam because they have the language of the Quran, and then some of the Western converts. There's this ridiculous idea. I won't mention names, but leading Western Muslims, I've heard say this, that the only place in the world where you had traditional Islam alive and well is Yemen or Syria or both. Right? They said this over the last 10, 15 years, and this is a real insult actually to the tens of millions of Muslims in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Southeast Asia.
What are they doing?
Well, exactly. and although our family have Arab ancestry, apparently, but I took that as a real insult to say, "What? So you're telling me and my ancestors and the hundreds of millions of very devout Muslims, they're not
bumbling along?" Yeah.
In fact, this is controversial. I will go forward and say that's almost a kind of racism. You get anti-South Asian racism from Arabs.
Oh yeah.
Now you're getting it from Western converts who've been in the Arab world, and they've adopted Arab racism. I mean, this has to be dealt with.
Brilliant.
There is so much greatness of Islam in South Asia.
Yeah.
Let's focus on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So, like Qawwali for me. I mean, we can go on.
The lyrics, right? So,
oh my god.
Yeah. So I'll confess. We still have a tape recording, which even my father used to play occasionally, of the Sabri brothers.
Oh yeah.
And their rendition of Balagh al-Ula bi Kamalihi.
Right.
Now, I wanted to translate the lyrics, but I couldn't because some of them are in Farsi, which I don't understand. But it's available online. Somebody did it last year.
Oh, wow, okay.
Google if you're interested.
How do you spell that?
Balagh al-Ula bi Kamalihi, which is a poem in praise of the Prophet, but it's based on the Mi'raj story. The lyrics are wonderful, absolutely wonderful. They're in Urdu, Farsi, and Arabic.
Oh, amazing.
But there's a great young academic who's done a pretty good translation.
Amazing.
Online. Google that. And there are other Qawwalid, Ya Sahib al-Jamal, for example.
Yeah.
Ya Latif, and many others. The meaning, one of my friends is into this Punjabi and Urdu poetry. Poets are Iqbal, just read Iqbal.
Yeah.
The Punjabi poets, the Urdu poets, they're just as good as the great Arab poets, as Rumi. And others. They're just so well known.
Absolutely.
And I think it's a great time actually, Islam in South Asia, for Muslims to rediscover all the greatness from that tradition and to translate some of this stuff from Urdu, Punjabi, Sindhi, Balochi, God knows what else. When I was teaching Pakistan for a year, I was really struck. I was associate professor, and you had a VIP culture, but we had a lot of effectively servants, drivers, and others. One of the drivers in our car for the academics, he was doing a very humble job, and he was from Pathan background, and at one point he quoted some classical Arabic poetry. إذا كان الغراب دليل قوم سيهديهم طريق الهالكين, he quoted suddenly while he's talking in Urdu, and I was gobsmacked.
How did he know that?
Well, because there is a very rich tradition of
poetry,
of enlightened, and Arabic, and learning classical Arabic and stuff, and he was doing a very humble job, but very content in it. And that line of poetry, by the way, means that if you appoint a crow as your guide, then it will lead you to the way of destruction, something like that.
Right.
Which is probably kind of discriminatory against crows, who have evolved to be great. Beautiful bird like everybody else, but in some cultures you pick on certain animals.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it's true. You've got so many questions. Please let me know if when you want to start.
No, I love this stuff.
You love it.
Yeah,
I'm really enjoying myself. Can I call myself a Muslim if I believe the Quran is a human text and Muhammad was inspired to utter the words like the baker turns wheat into bread? So almost like the revelation goes through the mind of Muhammad. Are you familiar with Dr. Abdul Karim Saroush?
Yes.
So he almost says this kind of thing, that the Quran was almost colored by Muhammad's personality or his own traits, whatever it was. So it went through him like a medium. So, I mean, what do you make of this sort of perspective?
Well, before Sarouj, I believe Fadl Rahman said something very similar.
He did, and he's from Pakistan, right?
Yes.
And he was also persecuted. He had to go to America,
Right.
didn't he? Yeah, because he left.
Right. I'd forgotten he was persecuted. Yeah.
Then he taught in Pakistan, and then he taught in America.
Yeah, I know you knew the professor in the US.
Yeah.
Right. So, okay. So I think now is the time to revive another ancient debate, and that's about the nature of the Quran.
Go
right?
for it. Yeah.
Muslims should be aware that the first Inquisition in Islam, actually way before the Galileo and stuff, when we point finger at Christianity, but within Islam was the Mihna. We're talking about what, 3rd century of Islam, the Abbasid caliphs, especially Al-Ma'mun and his successors, persecuting the Hadith scholars actually, who insisted that the Quran was uncreated. That's the word, uncreated.
What does that even mean?
Yeah, exactly. We're trying to simplify that. The Mu'tazilites, who were the early, if you like,
Rationalists, right?
Semi-rationalists actually.
Right.
The philosophers were the full rationalists of Islam.
Okay.
My colleague at Quilliam, actually, Sheikh Salah al-Ansari, he pointed out the Mu'tazilites had a strong traditional bias as well. I mean, they used to quote Hadith and Quran and Hadith. So it'd be true to say they're the semi-rationalists.
Okay.
They're not full rationalists. They were the philosophers who were. Anyway, but the Mu'tazilites said that the Quran is created, makhluk, and the Hadith scholars insisted, most of them, that it was ghayr makhluk, uncreated, and that led to this Inquisition. Imam Ahmad bin Hanbal was flogged for that. Some of the Hadith scholars were slaughtered by Al-Ma'mun people, according to some narration by him himself. He was
really
very hard line. Yeah, there's some very graphic description you find.
He was also very pro-science, but then very cruel.
He was very rationalist. Yeah,
he was very rationalist, but very cruel at the same time.
Very cool in the Inquisition. Yeah, big time. Now, what was all that about?
Sorry, was he of the position that it was created?
Yes.
Oh, okay.
Yes. And he wrote this blistering letter about this, about saying people who say otherwise are fooled and completely wrong. But you know, in my view, obviously that went to extreme. That was very wrong of Al-Ma'mun to persecute people. Very, very wrong. And it was similar to the Christian controversies about the nature of Christ, because Christ is the Word of God, right? In Christianity, the Logos. Right. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God.
Yeah.
John 1:1, right? And it's related. Is Christ divine or human, or both? And Christians take all three perspectives, right? So a Christian friend of mine now says Christ was fully human and fully divine, etc., etc. Now, what happened was basically the same controversy came up in early Islam, because the Quran is the word of God, and it is kind of analogous to Jesus. And
also, was it when Muhammad spoke that was when it created, or was it uncreated, as in before even time began? Is that what?
Yeah, exactly. So the later Ash'ari school. So the Hadith scholars were saying it's uncreated. They were really talking about the origin of God's word. The God's, if you like, capability or potential or quality of speaking. That's uncreated. That's divine. Whereas the rationalists were saying that when we recite the Quran, this is all human sounds, human words, human thoughts. It's human. Basically, when they said created, they meant human, basically. And so this is not, so I know many people are discussing the Quran divine or human. It is not a new discussion. It's in my view, it goes back to the Mu'tazilites. Now, what's very interesting, I've written about that for The Guardian, is that the later Ash'ari school came up with a compromise. They basically said the Quran is of different levels. The word of God is of different levels. So even in modern linguistics, they talk about mentalese, which is the language of unspoken thoughts, or your thoughts, what language you think in. They talk about mentalese and the thoughts, and then they are translated into a language, a spoken language, right? So there's different levels of even our thoughts and meanings. And they said that at one level, the Quran is uncreated, it's divine, with God. But at another level, by the time we're speaking it and writing it, it is created. Even Imam Bukhari, the leader of the Hadith scholars, got into big trouble for this. This is why he was persecuted. People don't read his biography. I believe he died on the road. He kept getting thrown out of his villages. He was later posthumously realized how great he was. But he said that when I enunciate the Quran, lafzi bil Quran makhluk, when I speak the Quran, that is created. But the origin of the Quran, the essence of the Quran, is uncreated. But even that was too much for some people. They called him a heretic for that. They said, yeah, exactly. They said, you've just said that the Quran is created. So my view is that those who say that the Quran is human, they are still Muslims actually if they follow it, and they loosely they believe in one God, and they loosely at least attach themselves to the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because it's no different to the early Mu'tazilites and
so you're still within the realm of
Khalifa al-Ma'mun. And by the way, my view on this is that like the Ash'ari, the Quran is of different levels. So it's divine origin, it's the word of God, in its dominant aspect. But in some aspects, it has come through a human being, the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we know a lot of the verses are conditioned by the context of 7th century Arabia. So there are clearly human aspects of it, human elements of it. And we should revisit that old discussion and read Fadlur Rahman and Surush, but as well as the traditionalists, if you like. And anyway.
Absolutely, that's great.
It's a very important discussion for our age, actually.
It is.
The nature of the Quran.
Because I think that's what it comes down to. I mean, we keep talking about reform. We talk about, is it outdated? I mean, violent verses or peaceful verses, all these different discussions. At the end of the day, it comes down to how are we reading this book? It's not simply, but I suppose the surface level conversation is, what is the book saying? But the bigger question is, how are we going to interpret? How are we going to read this? Are we going to have a deeper understanding of it, or is it just simply superficial, surface level? Is it created? Is it not created? Is there any negotiation or wiggle room for interpretation?
Yeah, well, there's always been loads of interpretation. I would encourage people to read, for example, the Study Quran. Have you seen the Study Quran? It was published last year. Quite academic, but it's a translation of the Quran with different interpretation of each verse, Sunni, Shia, of each passage, should I say. They've given the main debate, and it's fascinating. You read any a good commentary on the Quran in the Arabic, or a good translation, you see the wide variety of interpretations of the Quran. For example, I was teaching my son last night the Surah Al-Mursalat yesterday. There's a verse which describes hell, and it says, "Innaha tarmi bi shararin kal qasri ka'annahu jimalatun sufr." It talks about hell throwing out great flames, but it describes the flames. Now, according to one interpretation, it says that the flames are like buildings or castles or forts, huge. But also like yellow camels, which apparently mean dark camels tinged with yellow. Right. That's one view, Jimalatun. But a completely different view says, no, the first word does not mean a building or a fort or a castle. It means tree roots, right? And the second word doesn't mean camels. It's referring to ropes, masses of ropes. And to me, tangled ropes, massive, thick tangled ropes. It says boat ropes, the ropes used for boats and ships. So, naval ropes. Now, that's in Ibn Kathir and, from the early commentators. And to my mind, and my 11-year-old son agreed with me, that the characterization of flames as looking like tree roots or kind of tangled and fractal shape, and also tangled ropes seem to make more sense than saying that the flames are like castles and camels. But which also has a meaning to it, meaning they're huge and of a certain. Now, I'll give another example. When I taught my older boys the Quran, I would always tell them different interpretations and say, "What do you think?" And they would always go for the rationalist, the most rationalist scientific one. For example, famous surah verse of Surah Al-Baqarah and other surahs about the Israelites. God says, وَرَفَعْنَا فَوْقَهُمُ الطُّورَ. We lifted the mountain above them and made them pledge allegiance to God. Right. One traditional view is that the angels literally lifted Mount Sinai on the children of Israel and said, if you don't, pledge the covenant with God, we're going to drop it on you, you're going to smash you all. So that's coercion, right?
Yeah, that is coercion. Yeah.
The other view that Abdullah Yusuf Ali gives, I think what I said in their commentary, is that the mountain was raised above you. Just mean it was a towering mountain above them. They were in awe of this incredible landscape. They were at the foot of Mount Sinai. And so they felt the power of God, and they accepted to pledge that. I told my young sons both meanings. I said, "What do you think?" And they went with the latter one, and same with many examples. Yeah. So coming back to how you read it, the other thing is, which is another discussion really, but that a lot of the practical kind of verses of the Quran are highly conditioned by the time and the situation, and are not supposed to be read as an instruction manual or textbook for every day and age without thinking. And a classic example of that is the verse which apparently seems to allow a man to hit his wife. right? Because as I showed in my paper on the subject, the early Mufti of Mecca, within a century of that verse, said categorically a husband cannot hit his wife, because that's within conformity with all the hadith which says a man must not hit his wife.
So then what does that do to the verse? I mean,
well, it was revealed in a particular context, and it was only basically allowed for very extreme situations, but it can be it can be abrogated by the time and the conditions. The Caliph Omar, the Prophet himself, but certainly the Caliphs, said this verse doesn't apply. The 8 categories of zakat. One of the categories, Caliph Omar said this. Sayyidina Umar said this verse doesn't apply anymore. This category doesn't apply, and he actually just kind of abrogated one category of zakat, which some schools still uphold. So the point is, this is not picking and choosing. It's understanding that certain verses were revealed for certain situations, for the welfare of those people, and if you just kind of blindly follow that without thinking in every time and place,
context,
you get very wrong answers, which is the problem we have now. You have all these fatwas, saying women can't study at university because they're mixing with men, or women can't go and do the shopping because they have to stay at home, and this and that. All of these fatwas come because people are forgetting the essential spirit of the Quran, which is mercy, the love of God, the sense of the sacred, and living an ethical, moral life. And in fact, the jurists agreed, you go in great detail, is every single ruling like that in the Quran is subject to time and space and condition. And the clearest example is, something we think is fundamental. You can't eat pork, you can't drink wine. That's in the Quran. But even the Quran says if you're starving to death, you can eat pork. You can stuff yourself with pork if you're starving. And if you're presumably if you're thirsty, I don't think, does alcohol quench thirst? I wouldn't know. But the jurists generally tended to say if you're dying of thirst and you've only got wine, you can drink as much wine as you like. So, but the point is that shows that even rules which we think are very hard and fast,
universal,
pork and wine,
all the time,
they can be adapted. And that's the big challenge. The nature of the Quran, but also how we read it and how do you apply it to today. Because it is people. If you apply to that thinking, you get ISIS, and you get and they're the most severe example. But you also get all kinds of abuses,
even if it's not
justice.
Even if it's not as extreme as ISIS, there's still many different.
Exactly. For example, oppressive laws against women, or especially marriage, divorce, inheritance, this, that, and the other. All of it is basically misunderstanding the verses and applying them out of context. The overwhelming spirit which should trump everything is mercy and justice. That is, for me, the Quran is very clear. It's full of exhortations to justice, compassion, mercy, forgiveness, and that should trump everything else.
Absolutely. How are we doing for time? Do you want to go for the 5-10 minutes max?
Actually, I think.
Or do you want to call it a
day? I think we should call it a day.
That's fine. I mean, we've covered so much.
If we. If my viewers don't mind, our viewers don't mind, I do apologize, but just coming back to the point, I'd just like to plug the
go for it.
Our task force report.
Please,
if you could put up that cover page again.
I've actually put it, guys. If you in the description, I've actually put it in the description. Is it Dr. Usama? Yeah, Dr. Usama Hasan's presentations. If you click on that, I believe. Let me just check it now. You should get a page.
Yeah, there's one more. That one. If you could put that in. Oh, right.
Because you have to go. Oh, it's this one.
Okay, no, never mind. You know what?
Oh, there it is, right at the bottom. That's the one.
The
one?
It's actually a different one, but never mind.
Okay.
Never mind.
I'll put it in the description anyway.
What I should do is, yes, please. I'll send you the link.
Yeah.
Again.
So what?
But this is the International Task Force Report on Islam and Science.
Yeah.
Muslim responses to science's big questions.
Yeah.
It's 200 odd pages, but there's some good summary essays at the beginning.
Yeah.
Please have a look if you're interested. It's downloadable for free, of course.
Absolutely.
I hope it's been of value. We must encourage learning, critical thinking, and discussion. I must emphasize the learning as well. Do read the Quran, the Hadith, the commentaries.
Yeah,
there is a lot of very rich heritage there. It's certainly not so very simplistic, one-line interpretation of everything. Read the commentaries. The Study Quran is probably a good place to start.
Study Quran.
Yeah, in English, published last year.
Is it a book?
Yeah, it's a book. About 30 scholars, academics and others, took 10 years to compile that.
Yeah, okay.
As I said, they gave different interpretations. There's a very rich tradition of understanding the Quran in many different ways, And as there is with science, different competing scientific theories, and in our task force, we tried to bring some of that together. And I think we had a very enriching conversation. Like I said, we had the followers of Ibn Rushd, we had the followers of Ghazali, we had the followers of Ibn Taymiyyah, we had the followers of Ibn Arabi. We had the 4 or 5 schools of thought between Islam and science, which I described over the last century. And it was absolutely riveting and inspiring conversation. So all the best, and God bless. And
absolutely. Someone has said very aptly, you should have a cup of tea now.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And on that note, guys, I want to thank you all for tuning in, and I want to thank Dr. Usama Hasan for coming in. You've given us so much of your knowledge, so much of your wisdom, your real pearls of sort of experience, and you're learning from both science and Islam, which I think has been absolutely valuable. I've really enjoyed this. We could go on forever. This conversation.
Thank you for having me. It's been a really honor and pleasure to talk to you. And
I would love to have you again. I would love to have you again in the future. And
that'd be lovely.
I appreciate the guys. Thank you very much. I really appreciate it, and I will see you next time. Assalamu alaikum.